Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung. So this was a really good book, and I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 5 stars. It was great. There wasn't too many flaws with the books, other than the traditional flaws with Jungian psychology. So what is the purpose of this book? The purpose of the book is to be like an introduction to Jungian psychology. Some guy approached Jung, some media person, and said, "Everybody knows about Freudian psychology, nobody knows about Jungian psychology. Dr. Jung, will you write a book that's for a general audience?" Because most of Jung's books are not for a general audience. I don't know if you read any, but they have a lot of jargon. So this book is meant to be like a general audience introduction to Jungian psychology, in the same way that there's a lot of Freudian books that are meant to be like general introductions to Freudian psychology. The other purpose of this book, besides being an introduction, is to be a study in the unconscious, because it's called Man and His Symbols, and symbols for Jung are things that belong to the unconscious. Or in other words, the reason why you would study a symbol is because there's unconscious meaning associated with symbol. And so this is, in some sense, also a study of the unconscious. Now, did the book achieve its goals in doing this? Yes. I think the book absolutely is a great introduction to Jungian psychology. I was looking for an introduction, but when I looked, I grabbed other books that weren't necessarily introductions. So for example, I read The Portable Jung before reading this book, and I wish I would have read this book before I read The Portable Jung. There's also Introduction to Alchemy by Dr. Franz. I'm going to read that one next. I don't know if it's going to be as good as this one though, because this is really a true introduction to Jungian psychology. On top of that, you do get to learn about like how people view the unconscious, but it's pretty far-fetched because it's Jung's view of the unconscious, which is a very strange worldview. So the book is good, it does what it wants to do, that's fine and dandy. Now what does the book actually talk about? So there are, I think, 5 or 6 chapters that are pretty lengthy, each of them. The first one would be like the nature of symbols. You're going to learn about the nature of symbols. I don't know if Jung wrote the chapter or if one of his students wrote the chapter, I don't remember anymore. But basically, if you think about like what a symbol means, for Jung it doesn't have this ordinary sense, right? Like if you think about, that's a symbol, Jung wouldn't use it that way. So, for example, if in the book he talks about this abbreviation, the UN, and he says that some people might think that this is a symbol, however, for Jung it is not a symbol. That is simply an abbreviation, and the reason why is because the meaning of UN is very clear. There's nothing hidden about the meaning of the abbreviation UN. It just means United Nations. Comparatively, if we take something like writing your name in red, this would be a symbol. Or if we write UN in red, this would also be a symbol. Why would it be a symbol? Because for Jung, red has a hidden meaning. Red would indicate life force or blood. These are kind of the examples he gives. And therefore, it has a hidden meaning. Another example of this might be when Ocasio-Cortez, that's how you say her name, I don't know, wore a dress that said "Tax the Rich," and the font was red and it looked like it was blood. This has a hidden meaning, and so there is a symbolism to that kind of stuff. Symbols can be more than just text, by the way. So symbols can be letters, they can be images, they can be people, they can be dreams. Symbols basically can be anything under the sun as long as there is a hidden meaning to the actual thing that's being depicted. Another thing we learn about in the introduction book, The Man and His Symbols, is the nature of the unconscious. So I knew Jung had a very strange view of the unconscious that wasn't actually quite like Freud's. People tend to think that they are because they were colleagues, but they're quite different. And in Man and His Symbols, he really lays like the metaphysics down for what his view of the unconscious is. He starts off by explaining that the unconscious exists in the realm beyond sensory perception. So you can't even measure it to begin with, which is why he's always saying that since there are things which we cannot measure, and since there are surely things that are important to talk about that we cannot measure, we should probably not only focus on measurement in science. This is why he says this so much. He says it so much that it almost is a detriment to him. But I get his point. I do agree with him that there are some things that we need to talk about that can't be measured. That being said, for Jung, the unconscious exists beyond what is measurable. It's not just neurology, whereas Freud would say that the unconscious is probably existing inside the brain. Jung would say that the unconscious is like an organism that exists in the noumenal. So it can never be perceived, it can never be measured. It is like more fundamental to reality. And it is also its own organism, and so therefore it's its own identity. He clarifies that in The Man and His Symbols, and he says that yes, the unconscious is a separate identity from your own conscious mind and is a separate thing. Dr. von Franz talks about how you can also make this idea of meaning residing in the unconscious more palatable. And he talks about how matter can understand matter. Jung doesn't add that. That comes in Dr. Franz's book. But that's Jung's view of the unconscious. It's very, very different than Freud or even just a cognitive science view of the unconscious. Another thing that he talks about in this book is individuation, which is a very important concept for Jungian psychology across the board. He has a lot of books written about individuation. Basically, since the unconscious is its own identity, it can have its own thoughts and feelings and intuitions. And he even says that it can have not quite precognition, but I think he calls it premonition. And this is just basically the unconscious can have ideas about the future, and it can warn you about these futures by giving you dreams. Okay? Since the unconscious is its own thing and the conscious is a separate thing, you have to make these two things work together, so to speak. Basically, mitigate the discrepancies between the two such that they're like almost a unison, or they're in unison. They're like two ice skaters skating together, okay? And the only way you can do this is this is what he calls individuation. And the only way you can reach this level of individuation is through dream interpretation, because for Jung, the unconscious can only communicate to you through dreams. I don't know why it's that specific. I don't understand why he said that. He doesn't clarify why he says that in the book. He just simply says that it's the case, that we don't get the motivation for that kind of analysis. But he says, dreams are the unconscious communicating to you, and you have to interpret your dreams and basically heed the advice of your unconscious and make it more compatible with the conscious. So for example, if you have a dream of a person, and in that dream, the person is very erratic, maybe it's someone you know, okay? And you go and meet that person in your life, you need to incorporate that unconscious dream into your conscious interactions with that person. So maybe you need to defend yourself against that person. Maybe you don't get too attached to that person because they're erratic. Something like this would be an example of reaching individuation. So that's some of the things the book talks about. There it also talks about like the hero myth and mythology as it relates to modern man, and it also goes into like a very specific person's dream analysis to show you how dream analysis works. I didn't find that stuff too interesting. But let's get into the pros and cons of this book, okay? The pros are that it's got a lot of qualitative detail, right? I always found that things like psychometrics or modern like statistical approaches to psychology are always lacking in a qualitative model. And so for that reason, it's not intuitive to understand, because humans are better with at understanding qualitative things than quantitative things. Quantitative things are a bit foreign to us, and they always focus on what is measurable. Going again back to what Jung says is, if we only focus on what is measurable, we can't talk about the important things that are not measurable, especially in human psychology. So I think that there's the pro in the sense that, there's a lot of qualitative detail in Jung. The drawback of this, however, is that you get crazy qualitative analysis that cannot even be debunked. And if you want to argue against it, you really can't, because it's just, you have to say, it's from axioms, right? You take the axioms as true, and you can't argue against axioms, because the whole point of axioms is to take them as true. If you want to refute somebody's axiomatic worldview, you just say, well, I don't accept your axioms. And it's just like that, right? The drawback here is he'll say things like, for example, one of his patients had a dream of, I don't know if it was Jack Frost. It was one of these like snow characters that always comes out around Christmas, who pinched her in her stomach, and she woke up, and he took this as a warning from the unconscious that she was going to commit suicide at a very young age. She did also later then, I think, die. I don't know if she committed suicide, but this is just an example of the crazy level of a dream analysis that Jung engages in. And it's not just Jung, it's also his students do really crazy levels of dream analysis. And he also has this problem where he says, for example, dreams are relegated to each individual. Like, the meaning of a dream is dependent on each individual, okay? There's no overarching grand framework we can rely on, right? We can't formalize dream interpretation. He then also says, for example, that there's motifs and that there are generalities in dreams. And it seems like he picks and chooses what's a motif and what's not, and what has a generally accepted meaning and what doesn't. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of methodology to delineate what's like his arbitrary whim versus what was like a systematic choosing. So it's like, on one hand, he's really against the formalisms, but on the other hand, he uses formalisms when it suits him. And I feel like this is going to cause problems for having any kind of intelligent discussion about dream interpretation. So that's the book, right? It's a good book. It's got its drawbacks, but that's just Jung, right? Jung always has these drawbacks. And it does explore some core concepts in Jungian psychology. And if you're gonna, so I'm reading all of Jung's volumes, and I would say if you're gonna start anywhere in Jungian psychology, start with Man and His Symbols. This would be, as far as I can tell, the best book to start with. Now, if you're not someone who wants to study Jungian psychology, do not read this book, I would say. Right? This book is not for you. If you just want to get some self-knowledge, learn about psychology, so on and so forth, do not read this book. This book is very esoteric, because Jungian psychology is very esoteric. It's a very strange way of viewing the world. And I would argue a lot of it's false, or if not false, just not useful. And there are better books out there if you just want to learn about yourself. But if you do want to learn about Jungian psychology, this is definitely a book for you. Even if you just want to start off with just a little bit, yeah, this would be a great book. So with that being said, tschüss.